We've got a really fascinating 45-minute session coming up with a really great panel about how technology can be used to conquer some of the big policy challenges which have been facing politicians and policymakers for decades. We've done some work in the past few years about how technology actually gives policymakers a better chance of conquering some of these big policy barriers and issues that we've been grasping with for a long time. If we introduce the panel, and then we'll just have 5 minutes each from each panelist before moving on to questions from the floor. To my right is Fernando, who is a successful tech and digital entrepreneur and an expert on social media, big data, and education 2.0. Jude Ower is the chief executive of Playmob, and Nadhim Zahawi is the MP for Stratford, and also the co-founder with Stephen Shakespeare of YouGov. I believe Jude is going to kick off.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Jude Ower. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Playmob. Just a little bit about my background. I spent 11 years creating games for training, education, and for awareness. And basically, I set up Playmob we're a startup tech company, but we believe that games can save the world in a number of ways. So currently, there's about 7 billion hours per week are spent playing games. And if we were to get this up to 21 billion hours, we can start solving some world problems like poverty, global warming, for example. Zynga are one of the biggest games companies in the world, and they've already kind of proved that you can start to make an impact on the world. They've raised about $10 million so far through their own games, and basically kind of created this through raised donations and awareness through using the communities that they have which exist in their games already. So we believe that we can teach people through games, we can educate through games, but also we can raise awareness and take action through existing games. Just an example of what we've worked on in Playmob so far. So our platform connects games to charities as a way not just to raise money, but also to raise awareness. An example of this is one of our first campaigns was in a game called Parallel Kingdom, and the charity was SOS Children. And we were raising money for the East African Famine Appeal. We raised $3,500 in a week. It was about 1 million players, about 10,000 players a day, and most of them are US based. Now, SOS Children picked Marsabit in Kenya as the recipient village to receive the funds. I don't know if it's just me having really bad geography, but I'd never heard of Marsabit in Kenya before. But all the players that contributed to this campaign, there was a flood of information about this in their forums, going straight to the charity website, finding out more about Marsabit in Kenya, and they even recreated the village within Parallel Kingdom as a way to remember the good that they did. So this had a really powerful effect on a game that's a kind of a small to medium-sized game. And there's other examples out there. So we could use games to teach people, to train people, but also we could use it to problem solve. And it was mentioned briefly through the cancer research presentation earlier, which I thought was really fascinating. But there's a game called Fold It, fold.it, which came out a few years ago, and it's about protein folding. And basically they use the power of gaming communities to bring millions of people together to try and fold protein cells online in a virtual space and solve problems. So it shows the power of a community within the gaming world. And also teaching people and raising awareness and doing research through existing games. And this is one of my passions, is how do we use what's already there to create a movement? And there's an example where in World of Warcraft it's been used for scientific research to try and model human behavior. So the example was scientists were trying to figure out what would happen if a virus or an epidemic started to spread. And they'd modeled a few different types of behavior, like people would catch the virus and try not to spread it. Some people would catch it and try and spread it. But the one model that they didn't capture before doing this test was curiosity. So people who hadn't signed into the game but heard about the virus just wanted to go in for a nosy and just check what was going on. Some people caught it, some people didn't, but it was one thing that they hadn't expected to happen. So that's kind of my angle on this, is that we can use games as a really powerful tool for education, for raising awareness, and for problem solving.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Fernando. I'm not texting my mum, by the way. I'm actually reading from this. I founded Techlightment, where I and a few 20-somethings in Shoreditch, when it was actually uncool to be in Shoreditch, developed actually the first automated advertising platform for Facebook, beating Silicon Valley to the punch, a British company. We did this without any external funding whatsoever. And this was actually before Facebook was a global phenomenon at all, so saw it early, and it was before anyone had even thought about using Facebook to understand human behavior, which was one of the drivers of what we were trying to do as well. We did have a look at how people behaved, and interestingly, how that behavior changed so dramatically as a result of some of the mechanisms digitally. And it helped us to kind of gain game-changing insight in terms of how people behave and their interactions between each other. And that understanding actually us and a load of other companies essentially contributed to start to change how actually marketing online works, which is quite a dramatic change in how money is spent. It was a huge market innovation, allowed us to rapidly expand, again self-funded, across Europe, US and Asia, and then we sold it 4 years later to Experian, a non-racy FTSE 100 solid performing business. What I'm getting at is that technology understanding behavioral change is inextricably linked, and critical components of creating kind of game-changing innovations, and policy should understand that. The web is finally, it's fundamentally changed the business and public sector landscape. It's allowing us to innovate at unprecedented speed, and to innovate today, tomorrow, and future, you need to understand and be part of this digital world, as I think we're all finding out, but really in quite depth. This is actually where much of the progress is going to come to tackle UK's big policy challenges: growth, jobs, personalised healthcare, and so on. I think we can do this in kind of three major ways. We need to remember them. One is what I found out is people drive innovation. It's a real blasé thing to do, but just think about it. There's a huge skills gap in technology, and this needs to be tackled pretty much head on, maybe in a revolutionary way, not an evolutionary way, if we want to see the levels of innovation we need in this country. Skills, by the way, in my view, doesn't mean necessarily education as it is now. For example, a computer science degree that lasts 3 years, where everything you've learned becomes obsolete the day you finish, isn't what I'd call skills. Maybe you could rename these courses to History of Computers or Computer Latin or something like that, I don't know. The second point is innovation comes from diversity. I know this because at Techlightment I employed over 100 people from Harvard to Hackney. I actually employed people from Tower Hamlets rather than using them as a PR vehicle. It's the diversity that fosters this creativity and new ways of thinking, and it worked for me. Added to the bottom line. And I think the other thing is you need to put community at the center of your innovation. And what I actually mean by that is it's not just about focusing on individual and personal data. It's about the interactions, lightweight or heavyweight, between individuals within community sets. And understanding that actually is quite a lot of data, but we can understand it, will allow you to kind of shape solutions and win big challenges around that knowledge. I mean, at the end of the day, the world, like the web, is a multiplayer game. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Nadhim.
Thank you, David. I feel like the odd one out here because I work in a place now where we basically produce so much paper that it feels obscene. Literally every single day I throw away, albeit we recycle it, but just reams and reams of paper, and only now we're beginning to adopt a sort of digital platform for example, select committee meetings. And even then there's resistance from colleagues, which I just find extraordinary, as to why we're doing this, because paper is so much more real. So thank you for having me here. I spent 10 years of my life working with Shakespeare, who you just heard from, and I now represent Shakespeare. in Stratford-on-Avon rather than Stratford East London. I thought I'd just talk to you about my own observations of the past 2.5 years of being a newly minted Member of Parliament and elected onto the Business, Innovation and Skills Select Committee. That was actually quite a good innovation. For the first time in the history of our Parliament, the Select Committees were elected rather than appointed, which meant some of the new intake, the 2010 intake, actually had a chance of getting onto the Select Committees, because if it was appointed, as it were, in previous parliaments, it would have meant seniority and experience in the place rather than outside of the place, would have counted for a lot more, and I would have probably not got onto the committee. Now, what do I think government is doing well and should do more of, and what should it stop doing and look somewhere else? The forecast at the moment is that the internet economy by 2016 will be 12% of GDP. And I think in one of the earlier sessions, someone was asking whether, is that ambitious enough? Where are we in terms of the sort of world stage as far as that's concerned? I mean, I don't think that's bad. I think we could probably look at doing more. But what can government really do in that space? Well, I think there are sort of three main drivers. One is opening up the data that it collects on our behalf, and you heard from previous speakers about how that's going, and not just opening up in PDF form. As someone said, you need to open up the raw data. Of course, you've got to have checks and balances around it in terms of abuse, and we've got to get our head around that in terms of how you legislate for that. But actually, the way you get the most out of it for the economy will be to allow as many entrepreneurs, as many as challenger companies like Guy and others, to have access to that raw data for it to really be powerful in terms of moving the dial for the economy. The second area is to be a facilitator. I chaired a session at the Quoted Companies Alliance, which is all the sort of small and mid-cap, some slightly bigger quoted companies, and we had the Treasury Minister come and speak. And my observation of that was there's a sort of laundry list of stuff that the government's doing at the moment. So many different, EIS schemes, taking them down to people who haven't found a job in a day rather than after a year or 6 months. Lots and lots of things, and lots of people in the audience were putting their hands up saying, we benefit from this or this other scheme. But no one really knew where to go as a sort of single touch point in government. And so one of the things I fed back to the Treasury team, to the Chancellors, look, we need a brand that people recognise, startups recognise, more, businesses in there, wherever they are in the cycle, that they can go to. And I'm glad, I think what's going to happen is the business bank that the Biz Department is now pioneering is going to sort of bring all that into one place, so that anyone thinking about either starting a business or needing funding to develop their business further can go to one place inside government, in the same way as sort of direct.gov has been for the citizen. And the third thing is making it the default setting that government services are delivered online. That every department is in that mindset. We heard, again, in the opening session, that only 50% of the 650 different interactions of services across government with the consumer are currently being delivered online. And 50% seems to be one of those figures which is you sort of get to and it's hard to beat, because only 50% of MPs are actually on Twitter, for example. And I think everyone should be on it. It's an amazingly powerful platform. And I guess my sort of two recommendations for government to sort of, one of which is to stop doing really badly, is how we engage and consult with the public. It is still unbelievably cumbersome and expensive. I remember before being a Member of Parliament, being asked to give evidence as then the CEO of YouGov to the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And I turned up there and they'd commissioned a survey, and this thing was just a static document, which was about sort of, half a foot in depth, that landed on a thud on everyone's desk, and we're going through this survey. And of course, the natural instinct is you look at some of the answers and you think, well, how can I probe that even further? One, you can't, because it is a sort of traditional survey, and so much of that is still done in that way partly because Whitehall is nervous of sort of the more sort of digital formats, because they think it'll become another sort of platform for those who are just angry with government and will skew the data. Well, there's lots of methodologies, not just at YouGov, that you can sort of mitigate for that. And I asked at the time on this panel, how much did this cost? This one, so it's 1,000 people, just 1,089 people at the time. And it cost that committee £389,000. Now, today, you would do that for a hundredth of the cost, if not less. And government needs to embrace that, whether it's through gaming, through some of the other innovations of how we engage with people and draw information out of them that they want to share with us, rather than having these sort of traditional consultation methods which really sort of go nowhere. And the last point, which I do think we really need to get a grip on, is the skills agenda that Guy was talking about. And I have a concern here, well, two concerns. One is management bandwidth. Warwick University has done a lot of work around this. In the UK, we've got some great entrepreneurs. We just sell out too early. There's a sort of great, one of my colleagues on the Treasury Committee, Jesse Norman, gave me this great line. He says, when a Brit sets up a successful company, at the first chance, they sell it and buy a sort of nice home on the golf course or a nice holiday home. And when an American sells their business, they sell it, they buy the nice home, but then they start up the next business and they keep going. When the German thinks about it, they just keep it for the generations to come rather than selling out too early. And that's important to sort of remember, that we do need businesses to not just sell to the big boys, but actually to become the giants of their industry. And the other area when it comes to skills is international students. My big campaign is to make my government take international student numbers out of the overall immigration target numbers. I think it's a real danger in this country that we're perceived to be, closed for international students to come to the UK. We're not a friendly place now as we were before for attracting the brightest and the best. Although my government, the coalition government, will say that we are. I think we ought to do what the Australians have done in other countries. We should be clever about how we effectively use that data, or how we target the Home Office in terms of its own commitment. So those are the sort of observations. Thank you for having me here. More than happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. If I can just kick off by asking a very quick question. Nadhim, you talked about the hostility amongst some of your colleagues about introducing electronic select committee papers. And a lot of what we've heard so far today has been about how fast-paced and how quick-moving the change and innovation is in all the sectors we've been discussing. Do the three of you think that government is sometimes too risk-averse, too reluctant to move quickly, to really embrace these possibilities as much as they could? We start with Guy and move along.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
I think, I think there's also a point about, I think dealing with a nuance of complexity like immigration, where you have lots and lots of variables, is not a paper solution, right? And the other thing is, if you implement a paper solution to solve existing more complex nuances, you're going to get into trouble. So, in my view, you need to really embrace technology and make it work really iteratively. Otherwise, you're not going to solve some actually pretty complex solutions in the first place. And that, I think it's actually riskier for the government to be doing what it is now than being even more aggressive around technology adoption, given the macro impact in the world and the negative resultant impact it's having on our economy, especially against China, India, etc.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But also, I wonder if as startups, we can teach the government, how to work in an agile way, and apply our methods to, try quickly, fail fast, or learn and move on, or just working with more startups. Could we try and test more ideas in a much quicker way, and understand what works and what doesn't work? Yeah.
But look, you're right that we do need to do more. I'm glad that those who are resistant to having their committee papers on a tablet are in the minority. Where we do need to do more, I think, is in government procurement. And if you look at some of the IT projects, and I haven't done a sort of a scientifically robust study of this, but anecdotally, we tend to very quickly in government, or the machinery of government reaches out to the usual suspects, the big consultancies, the big IT players. They are not generally the most innovative. And the challenge is, how do you open it to startups and challenger brands? Because around that whole thing is then, how secure are those smaller businesses in terms of, surviving long enough to be able to deliver the project in the first place? And that's where I think we need to be much braver, and just go for it. Just open up and let these smaller players get the benefit. The Americans do it quite well. You look at how they use, for example, their science budget. In the UK, the science budget, as the moment a project leaves a university and becomes anywhere close to becoming commercial, the government stops engaging. It stops wanting to fund it. The Americans go much further. They keep going in terms of funding it, but also they get the departments within government. So the Department of Defense in America is the biggest buyer from startups in the defense sector, or in the sort of technology related to defense sector. Now that's a massive client to have. If you're a startup, the hardest thing when we were starting YouGov was to get our first client. Anyone who's started a business, that's really the hardest place. If you can get your government to be that client, then that's a great place to be.
I think there's another thing about the small business versus big business in terms of risk. I think very soon, a big business will be riskier to contract than a small business, which is more specialized and agile in an area. And I think that change is coming pretty quickly, and we might not be ready for it, but it is.
Interesting.
But it is.
Interesting. Does anyone have any questions? We've got a couple of mics. There's one at the back there. And probably take two at once. There's another one here as well.
Hi there. I find myself agreeing with almost everything that the panel's saying. There's one thing I'd like to challenge Nadhim on, which was his assertion that the best place for the single touch point might be the business bank. Having just made reference to the government digital service and DirectGov, which is really innovating in terms of how it makes services available to citizens, I would have thought that is a better model, and in fact that is the platform via which access to business services should also be delivered. I'd just like to know what you thought about that.
Maybe I didn't explain myself well. What I really meant by that is we sort of need a brand that people recognize as to where to come to when they're setting up a business. If you talk to SMEs, most surveys indicate that people just don't quite know which bit of the business department or UKTI, whatever it is that they need to go to. How you then distribute it, I absolutely agree with you that you look at what's happening in direct.gov or any other initiative, then you can do that. It's just we've had a sort of laundry list of announcements in the last 2.5 years of stuff, and actually you sort of almost want to stop announcing more new initiative and just concentrate on delivery. Just get some of those things working, and for people to be engaging with them and getting the benefits out of them. Because we're throwing billions and billions of pounds into this stuff, and you want it to go to the end user, the person who is going to develop their business or start a business.
The gentleman here.
Thank you. Just a follow up on your point about whether it's soon going to be riskier to focus on big business or small business. And I think I agree with your point that actually it will be riskier to rely on older existing approaches. One of the challenges is how that risk is measured, and if the way in which we measure risk is ability to have delivered in the past or how long they've been trading for, then actually the measurement will always go back to those existing organisations. So there's a challenge about how governments measure risk.
I think it's the black swan thing going on as well, because I mean, historical data, as we know from financial markets, does not necessarily reflect future performance, and Lehman's is a case of that. So I think, and then there will be more of those cases, and that will increase exponentially, along with the increase in technology. So I think you've got to make decisions based kind of old school style, based on, whether you think they have got capability, offset cost versus risk, work in smaller iterations, which reduce risk. You know, that's the one thing that always reduces risk. Right? It's constant.
And
So even just, sorry,
no,
even just like consulting with a group of entrepreneurs. I mean, I'm a member of something called the E20, and the E20 was brought together the day before the Maid Festival in Sheffield, where 2,500 people descended on Sheffield, either people with businesses or wanting to set up their own businesses. So the E20, the day before, basically got 20 entrepreneurs and 20 experts in a room talking about what we do with the lost, how we solve the problem of the lost million. And it was just an afternoon where entrepreneurs just thrashed out ideas. So, you know, there was no risk there, but, you know, at the end of the day, we had to present ideas back to the Duke of York and create a group to be able to start actioning these plans. And this is, you know, the companies get involved as they can. So, you know, can bigger companies take on people for like internships? But I just think just having that type of setup is a great way. You know, entrepreneurs love problem solving. And I think the more we can do, you know, that's completely kind of risk-free way of being able to bring out some ideas and see how we solve them, and then see how we can take them forward, and even kind of testing out entrepreneurs and small businesses to see who would be the right candidates to deliver this. But I just think it was a great way of working, and I'd love to see more of that happening.
And it is a cultural shift. It's a mindset thing, which I think you're referring to. And I think one of the ways is transparency, you know, and simplicity. So if people can actually see, you know, what the procurement project is, who's bidding for it, what you'll get is very quickly other people saying to you, you know what, this little company, you know, they've got a patchy track record, don't go with them. And if everything is open and transparent, then that actually mitigates against the risk.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. I just wanted to say something a little bit sympathetic to the government's slow pace on, governments in general slow pace on this stuff, so I have no brief for them. I mean, it's one thing to be an entrepreneur and say, fail fast, move on quickly to the next thing. But entrepreneurs don't have everybody from the Daily Mail to Private Eye looking over their shoulder. And if a government tries something and it fails, it may, as it were, have been a perfectly legitimate failure, a perfectly legitimate small experiment. But the result is going to be an article in the Daily Mail or wherever saying, government blows £50,000 on X, Y, and Z, or government wastes time and effort on little startup no one's heard of. So I think there's more required than a change in attitude on the part of MPs or ministers. There's actually a sort of more fundamental thing about how media and society in general and voters look at this stuff that needs to be part of the solution too.
Well, I'd love to have a headline where government fails with a £50,000 project.
Yeah.
Because the NHS IT programme, which was 12 billion, you know, was as big a failure from some very reputable big brands who were meant to be, you know, gave us the assurance, gave the previous government the assurance that this will all be delivered. Or, you know, there's so many examples on this. You know, the fire service response unit. There are still buildings, our buildings in Wolverhampton, sitting there with I think with a £6,000 coffee machine in it, and you know. £450 million later, no one's using it because the IT didn't work inside it. So that risk it applies to the bigger bona fide companies that are already delivering for government, as well as the startups. I just think we just have to just be a bit more, bit braver about this and go with the little guy.
It's about courage, isn't it? I mean, imagine every day. There were 10 stories about £50,000, £20,000 mistakes. I promise you in about 3 weeks of that, the press will be completely disinterested about coffee machines and things like that, right? So if you have lots of little failures, they don't become very big stories, right? A £12 billion failure is a big story.
Jude, did you have anything to?
No, I was just thinking about how many startups you can create from £12 billion.
I know, goodness. I mean,
It's insane.
It's insane, isn't it?
Gentleman over here has a question.
So just James Morris from Greenberg Research. Two things. One, we had that stat 8% of GDP coming from the internet economy at the beginning, and everyone was very pleased about that. But it was from 2010, our financial services industry had just crashed. We don't have much manufacturing, and a lot of it was retail. So I'm not sure we should be that positive about that number. Second thing is, you were the first person to mention defence spending, and apart from in the video we had at the beginning, there's pictures. We had Colossus and Turing. The internet came out of DARPA. how important is the Department of Defence in spurring innovation in the areas that we're considering?
Well, let me take the first bit of your question. I think in terms of manufacturing, most people think we don't have any manufacturing. We've got 11% of GDP still manufacturing. Now that's halved since 1997. It was about 22% in 97. But we're still, we're now the biggest exporter of cars. Now those companies are not owned solely in Britain, but Tata's doing brilliantly in my constituency with JLR. They will make a £1 billion profit this year and spend £1 billion every year for the next 3 years on innovation, R&D, which is amazing. And when you go in there and see some of the stuff they're doing, it is absolutely extraordinary. And I'd want them to do more in reaching out to schools so that kids can think of an alternative route maybe to university to go into those sort of industries. But I think you're right. In terms of we need to sort of get smarter at not picking winners, but what sectors we look at backing. And I was one of the handful of MPs who were part of something called the 2020 group that called for an industrial strategy, and specifically not about picking winners, but about focusing on sectors that we can go for. In terms of defence, I think it's an important department, and absolutely right. It should play a part, and I think look at what, for example, the Department of Defence does in America. Although the budgets are very different, the quantum is just enormous in America. But it's not just that one department; it's every other department. So the Department of Health can be much smarter. And one of my colleagues, George Freeman, who again one of the new entrants into Parliament, has done a load of work on the life sciences side, where the CEOs of some of the life sciences companies that I met with him, who came to the launch of this new initiative where we're opening up the data within the NHS, were saying this country will be the most innovative when it comes to this, and which is why some of them have reversed some of their decisions that they were going to take, which is sort of to place some of their research somewhere else around the world. But every department can play a role, and actually one of the areas is looking to the thing I mentioned earlier about the science budget, and where should government stop and where should it keep going and back some of the startups that come out of our universities. And I think that's an area we're missing.
I find it very difficult actually to understand how they classify the internet economy actually in the first place. Is Burberry an internet company, or is Topshop or ASOS? I thought it's a fashion retailer. What is it? Any sort of sports companies have got digital, fridges which connect to the internet. Is that a fridge or an internet economy? How do you class it? And I think next year or the year after, it'll be even more difficult. And actually, what I'm trying to say is it's really dangerous to say internet economy, because frankly, it's just going to be plugged into just about everything. So things are going to be connected as people are going to be connected to their devices and each other through the devices. So trying to sector these things off is the wrong question and the wrong stat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. But also when we're talking about backing sectors, I think if you look at the games industry in the UK, we've gone from being like number 2 in the world right down to number 5. Yeah. Because most people are moving to France or Canada where they've got better tax breaks. But I know that it's starting to change in the UK now, but there's kind of various rules and restrictions, like you have to make a game which is British in order to comply to the tax breaks. And I don't know what that means. We're still trying to get our heads around it.
Hugh Grant's got to be in it.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it will get better. But I think hopefully we'll start to see improvements. Gaming is making more than films and TV right now. So it's a really important industry for the UK. And if we look at the industry in terms of the makeup and games, we're still really heavily focused on console gaming, even though my belief is that console gaming and premium games are dying. It's all free to play and microtransactions that are the way forward, but it's mindset trying to get around that. But if we could be doing more to support digital games in the UK, we'll see, we could hopefully get a ranking back up to 2. 1 would be even better.
Interesting that both Jude and Nadhim mentioned something around industrial strategy. And some kind of industrial strategy, and that's something Policy Exchange will be doing a fair bit of work on over the next few months, just to throw a plug in there. I think we've got time for another couple of questions, if anyone would like to. Gentleman at the back.
About skills, if IBM and Google struggle to get the people with the right skills in their organizations, how does government get people with the right skills to provide innovative services or services in a new way? How would that work with the Daily Mail and people being paid more than the Prime Minister? What's the innovative solution to getting the right people in government, taking risks and providing new services?
Jude, you want to kick off?
Yeah, so there's 1 million unemployed young people in this country who've got lots of digital skills. And I'll just tell you a little example. So about 2 months ago, a young girl called Gintari, who came to the UK from Lithuania, and was an artist, community kind of work, art history. She came to a course which taught kind of how to make technology-related apps, advanced ones actually, Facebook, Open Graph, all sorts of really complicated things. And then a month after that, she entered the Facebook World Hackathon against 200 of the best engineers in the UK and won it. So you've got someone who's learned English, couldn't speak English, who's gone from art to making computers in 5 days, doing a bit more work, and then winning against 200 computer science, proper PhD engineers. So if you follow that hypothesis through and you try it and you do it more and more with people from disadvantaged communities or unemployed youngsters who actually have inherent digital skills by the fact that they're, connected and mass consumers of this stuff, and you try and unlock that talent, not through sitting in a classroom for 4.5 years learning something that's obsolete, but by making consistently. You've got 2 drivers, right? One, you're building their portfolios. So if you just imagine a degree course was make an app every week. By the time you finished in a year, you would have made a lot of apps. That's a big portfolio. It would have been spread across lots of technologies, and the chances you get a job are very high indeed. So you've got to balance out, kind of in terms of the skills issue. I think that's what I mentioned earlier about it's not an evolution of education we need now. I think it's a complete revolution because technology has changed what teaching means to a certain degree. There's another case in point where, I don't know if you saw the news, it was on TechCrunch, but they dropped in a whole bunch of tablets to some communities, remote communities in Africa, and got some youngsters self-teaching on these tablets without any teachers. And their numeracy and literacy just went through the roof in a very short space of time. That's not to say, we don't need teachers. I think there's other things which aren't knowledge transfer in terms of fact. It's more like, I think maybe teachers' roles need to change to do with more facilitation, coaching, discipline, things like that. I think there's a revolution needed in education. Otherwise, we're in real trouble.
Good.
Yeah, no, one of our investors set up he co-founded a group called Coder Dojo in Ireland, and that's kind of taken the world by storm now. But it's coding school on a Saturday for kids. So they've got kids as young as 7, coding, building apps, launching apps in iTunes. It's amazing. We want to hire them, but they're too young. But just to see the kids like on a Saturday, it's like for them it's not even it's not going to school. It's learning, it's building, it's doing stuff that they love in a safe place where if they can't do that at school, or maybe it isn't the environment to do it at school, they've got to do it elsewhere. And they absolutely love it. So I think we've got to see more of that to get good coders. I know that one of the problems that we've got is trying to find good coding skills at Playmob, and everybody's kind of vying for the same people. So we are looking at kind of home-growing people ourselves. We've just hired somebody who he's not a coding guy, but work from business on the business side. From the Peter Jones Academy, and he's 18, so entrepreneurial, will literally just turn his hand to anything, and it's been a fantastic resource for us on all of our social media. And he's 18 and he's I've never seen anything like it.
Right.
So, you know, our doors are completely open to bringing in young people and home growing them to what the business needs.
I also think there's a nuance about learning to code and learning to make. It's a big, vast, huge difference. There's a 16-year-old guy in San Francisco that we're partnering with. He's created this thing called Make Games with us. At 16, he taught himself to make an iPhone game. That game went ballistic, and he made a lot of money. So what he did was then get his whole high school class into his living room to just make games. 3 of them went ballistic. Then he got funded by Y Combinator. He's now at the grand old age of 18, sitting on several million quid. He will not finish school. He will not get a degree. He is one of the most numerate, well-spoken. I mean, his maths is incredible. He's taught it himself. And he's partnering with us because he reckons he can get a non-coder to Angry Birds, creating Angry Birds level 1 in 8 hours. That is, so we're trying it, you know, mad. He's mad enough, so fair enough. But I think there is a thing about, you know, it's about making, because the other thing is if you're learning about the history of code or whatever else, or it's quite boring, especially to a disenfranchised 14-year-old who's got the attention span worse than me, then you've got some issues. Whereas if they're getting kind of adrenaline rushes every 5 minutes, you're gaming it, you're gaming the learning of making a game, then they're creating something from nothing. You know, there's a hip hop film coming away. It's almost like that sort of street style called Hip Hop, creating something from nothing. That's the name of the film. And it's about how the hip hop industry created musicians who weren't formally trained, who weren't educated in music. They use technology, they mix samples together to make music, and there's a great quote from a guy called Grandmaster Caz, you know, for those who might be familiar with him. But he says, hip-hop invented nothing, it reinvented everything. And I think that's what we're kind of on the zone about talking about, I think, with getting skills. It's get them making, not learning how to code, get them making something.
Yeah. And it's showing what they can achieve as well. So, you know, if you show young people that they can make a game, but these are the things that you have to do to be able to do this, then that's going to be a bigger driver rather than kind of doing the, you know, they might learn to code and they might play games, but they haven't made the link between the two.
That's the competition, right? So, you know, competition for all of us here is Call of Duty 2, right? Because we want them to be rather making Call of Duty 2 than playing Call of Duty 2, and I believe we can make it as interesting to be making Call of Duty or modding War of Warcraft, which people are already doing, right? To give them an advantage. And building that into the games is more likely to get people to make and create something out of nothing.
You've just noticed your question and how animated the 2 entrepreneurs were in terms of how you get and embrace the sort of disruptive nature of technology and not be frightened of it. We need the same thing in government. And I'm going to plug a pamphlet I'm working on, which is about how we govern ourselves, with the relationship between politicians and the civil service, which will come out hopefully in a few months' time. Because I think there are lessons to be learned in there as well. But just a quick point from my own experience, I've got a great primary school in one of my market towns in Stratford, Shipston Primary School. The head teacher is incredibly innovative. So he's basically managed to get through sponsorship and a bit of funding, tablets, iPads for all the primary school kids, and also this little robot that comes into the school. And if you watch those little children and how they are interacting, learning online, because suddenly the tablets is they're opening the whole world up online in that one school. It's how you've got to free up more schools. And again, this isn't the party political point, but you know, Labour did start well, actually John Major did, but Labour effectively pioneered the academies status, which allows schools, head teachers, to be free from the dead hand of sort of local authority control. There were 200 2.5 years ago. There's now over 2,200. And you've got to open that up to allow them to make those sort of decisions. One of my kids' friends at school, he's 16, he invented Sumly, this thing, I don't know if some of you would have read about it. The headmaster allowed him a 2-year sabbatical because he wants to continue with his education. He wants to come back to it. But he's so busy now being funded by Li Ka-shing and a load of tech funds to develop this thing. But he's allowed to do that whilst maybe wanting to come back to his education. And of course, the other thing is non-conventional routes into. You don't have to go to university. Apprenticeships is a great way of doing this. And again, we're now up to 1 million apprenticeships, and not just technology, in all sorts of other sectors as well. So those are the sort of things that you need to do in government, but we should do more of, I think, in terms of how you make the civil service more interactive.
I'm very sorry to say we've run out of time. I'm being pointed out and asked to close down from over there. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists for making it really riveting. And something that's really come across to me is the importance of agility, the importance of adaptation, but also the importance of entrepreneurs and enthusiasm to digital government and the digital economy. Thanks again to Google for putting on such a fabulous event in such a great space.